right on the edge of Europe, a place that offends so many European values. We've come to Minsk to meet up with Britain's youngest newspaper proprietor. We're on our way to a rare meeting that Yevgeny Lebedev has managed to secure. Not many get to see the corridors of Belarusian power. This is an opportunity to put on the spot the man known as Europe's last dictator. It's also a challenge for the ambitious son of a Russian oligarch.
President Alexander Lukashenko has been in power for 18 years. He's been accused of torture and human rights abuses. He has thrown his opponents in prison, banned protests, and restricted freedom of expression. The Belarusian strongman is banned from traveling to Britain and the United States. And Western journalists rarely get a chance to hold him to account.
The night before the interview, preparations are underway in a hotel in central Minsk.
I decided not to start on international policy, but more on him as a man.
Yevgeny Lebedev, once labelled as London's latest it boy, is now in the role of a foreign correspondent for a newspaper his father bought for him.
I come here as a journalist for the independent newspaper. The article that I will write will be in the independent newspaper. He considers himself an authoritarian leader.
An authoritarian style.
Authoritarian style.
So what does he expect from the Belarusian leader?
I think one of the interesting things about this is I really have no idea how it will go. I think it's the first one that I've done where I really do not know what to expect. But apparently, according to his press secretary, he's up for a fight.
Lebedev's own father made his billions after the breakup of the Soviet Union and the chaotic, rapid privatization of state monopolies that made a handful of Russians rich and left millions in poverty. Alexander Lukashenko never allowed that to happen in Belarus.
The route that this country, your country, Belarus, took was very different from the one that Russia took. To my mind, Russia went the route of plenty of democracy. In the 1990s, plenty of democracy, but not very much fairness. And Belarus went the opposite way. There was plenty of fairness and not very much democracy. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Вы передо мной поставили такой вопрос, что я задумался, а неужели справедливость – это не свойство и принцип демократии? Я всегда считал, что если это истинная демократия, то это прежде всего справедливость. Основой политики моей прежде всего является честность и справедливость. Поэтому я бы не сказал, что в 90-е годы в России была демократия, а справедливости не было. Никакой там демократии не было. Это были страшные годы анархии, но у нас удалось, правильно вы сказали, пресечь эти поползновения и спасти страну.
But the relative stability of Belarus comes at a price. There is no presidential term limit here, and the 1996 referendum consolidated President Lukashenko's power. Not a single election here has been deemed as free or fair by the West. Not a single opposition candidate won a seat in the recent parliamentary vote. Protests have been violently suppressed. But Lukashenko says Western calls for democracy in Belarus are hypocritical.
Нас, американцы, хотят демократизировать. Хорошо, но вы идите Саудовскую Аравию демократизируйте. Что, мы похожи на Саудовскую Аравию? Да нам далеко до нее. А почему не демократизируют? Потому что сукин сын, но наш.
Referendum gave you huge powers over this country, and that was to appoint the Prime Minister, who appoints the government, to appoint half of the Senate, to appoint some of the judges, appoint the head of the KGB, and also appoint the head of the Electoral Commission. Do you think that's too much power concentrated in the hands of one man?
Да, это много. Но, как я считал, и считали тогда многие, и народ нас поддержал, у нас не было другого выбора. Нам надо было спасти страну. Нам надо было объединиться вокруг кого-то, чего-то, всем вместе и выстоять.
А сейчас, не думаете, не пришло
Don't you think
время
it's time to open up? Lebedev asks.
от такой концентрации?
Если бы с вашей стороны не было этого оголтелого давления и подстегивания процессов центробежных сил здесь, по разным причинам, оторвать от России, как вы говорите, там, или еще чего-то, может быть. Но вы нам создаете, вы нас наоборот толкаете от этого процесса, о котором вы только что сказали.
The West's real agenda, the president says, is to open up the Belarusian economy, which would make it vulnerable to the problems of the rest of Europe.
Сейчас мы это сюда. Это сюда.
Irina Harib is a journalist for a Russian newspaper owned by Lebedev's father. In 2010, Irina and her husband, a former presidential candidate, were jailed for organizing protests. Their son, Danya, was 3 at the time. Authorities threatened to take him away. International pressure got Irina out of jail and under house arrest.
В тюрьме разрешена прогулка 1 час в день. Под домашним арестом запрещена. В тюрьме можно писать письма и получать. Под домашним арестом запрещено. Это были муки ада, я вам честно скажу. В СИЗО было как-то легче. А еще осознание того, что арестантом является твой сын.
Today, Irina is allowed to leave the house, but not the city. Police visit regularly, often in the middle of the night. And she has another trial pending.
One of our journalists, Irina Khalib, has been arrested, and she's in this country. She can't leave the country. I can vouch for her personally. I know she's not a criminal. Can I ask why she's not even allowed to go and see a doctor in Moscow?
А что у нас, Павел? Я думал, она в Москве.
Нет, она здесь.
The president looks surprised. Isn't she out of the country already? He turns to his aides. No problem, he says. Send her to Moscow with Yevgeny tonight. Then, minutes later, a memo arrives. Being dictator isn't such a bad thing, Mr. Lukashenko jokes. There you go, and don't bother bringing her back.
И не провозите. Можете у себя оставить.
Спасибо большое, Евгений, что вы задали этот вопрос, потому что...
Later that day, Lebedev brings Irina the news. Irina's grateful, but she tells him she's also skeptical.
Ну вот посмотрим, чего стоит слово Александра Григорьевича.
Да, это правда. А как вы вообще оцените ситуацию сейчас?
Because President Lukashenko's Belarus can be a dark, secretive place, where what is said in public doesn't necessarily correspond to reality. Many believe that was the case with the Minsk metro bombing, an explosion that killed 15 people in April of 2011. Within 48 hours, police arrested 2 young men. Within weeks, they were convicted and executed. The BBC Newsnight investigation into the attack raised the possibility that security services were involved in the bombing, and the mother of one of the men said confessions were extracted under torture.
Вы знаете, к нам сразу приехали
Lukashenko dismissed allegations of torture and said the investigation was always under his personal control and that the Interpol agreed with its results.
Although we are just observers, I ask Yevgeny to follow up on this answer. Your own correspondent who covered this trial, your own newspaper, talked about what a sham it was and that it was basically a show trial. The BBC had evidence that some of the things said by the judge were simply absurd. What does the president say to that?
А если вы хотите удостовериться лично, по-моему, у нас суд записан был полностью на пленку. Пожалуйста, садитесь и смотрите. Мы вам можем копии представить эти даже. Идите, оценивайте. Тем более, вы что, хотите меня склонить к тому, что я сам себя взорвал?
After the interview, the president and Yevgeny disappeared for a private meeting. At the end, Lebedev never really challenged the Belarusian leader.
It has taken the son of a Russian oligarch to get us rare access to this place and to a man known as Europe's last dictator. The fascinating 4-hour-long conversation between them revealed a man who is well aware of his reputation and yet convinced that his country is on the right course.
This is a country where facts are easily manipulated and public accountability is scarce. Which is why, back at her house, Irina says she has nothing to celebrate yet.
Он об этом сказал Евгению Лебедеву. Он не сказал об этом уголовно-исполнительной инспекции милицейской, которая осуществляет весь этот надзор. Слова вообще, кем бы они ни были произнесены, юридической силы не имеют. Юридическую силу имеют бумажки с подписями и печатями. Даже в тоталитарном государстве.
And even if President Lukashenko keeps his promise, she doesn't want to leave Minsk. This is her home. Like so many others, Irina wants to find her freedom here, in Belarus.